Good morning, everybody, or good day, everybody, because this could be anywhere in the world. It's morning in Vietnam. It's late in the evening in Chicago. Um, and I'm Brian Neely from the American Center in Ho Chi Minh City. And we have with us today Dominic Lamberti, who's going to talk about highly selective college admissions. He's the Senior Assistant Director of Admissions at the University of Chicago. And the University of Chicago is one of the finest universities in the US. And just like with Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, everybody in the world wants to go there. So they have to be really careful about who gets in, and because they don't have room for everybody in the world. And so Dominique is going to talk to you about how to manage that process. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and let Dominique do the work.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian, for that introduction. I appreciate it. Really excited to be with everyone wherever you're coming from. As Brian noted, it's morning in Vietnam, but it's the evening here in Chicago. If you can see my background, I've got the lovely University of Chicago quad behind me and on a warmer, nicer day. As Brian mentioned, I'm a Senior Assistant Director of Admissions at the University of Chicago, working on our international team. There's sort of a caveat to all of this. We're focusing in on undergraduate admissions. I only work with undergraduates, and specifically, I am the regional counselor for a few different areas around the world. So I read applications domestically in the United States for Iowa and Kansas, but internationally, I review applications coming from most of Canada, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Singapore. I also have experience reading applications in places like Thailand, Hong Kong, a few other places throughout the world. So I'm very excited to talk to you just generally about highly selective college admissions. So just to give you a sense of what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to talk first. My PowerPoint will cooperate. Talk first through this quick overview. I'm going to really break down what does it mean to be highly selective in very basic terms. What is holistic review or holistic admissions? This is a term that you will hear a great deal in US admissions, particularly around highly selective admissions. And so this is something that I do want to delve a little bit deeper into and hopefully demystify for you. And then I'll talk a bit about what the different parts of the application are and how they're used. And then at the end, I want to leave plenty of time for questions. Happy to answer anything about college admissions generally, anything that I cover in today's presentation. Really just want to be here as a resource for you. And so I want to leave plenty of time for that. So to jump right in, as Brian mentioned, on a very basic level, what does it mean to be highly selective? It means not every applicant is going to be admitted. Highly selective institutions are going to have admit rates as low as 6% or maybe even slightly lower. Somewhere to 6 to 10% is generally what you're thinking of. And then into selective institutions, 10 to 20%. So again, places that are not necessarily easy to gain acceptance to, but that are looking at applications in a different way as well. A bottom line as to why that occurs is that, again, as Brian mentioned, we offer an education that a lot of students are excited about, whether it's at UChicago or another one of our highly selective peers. We generally are receiving far more applications than there are spots available. So to give you a sense of what that's looked like in the past in UChicago's context, last year we had over 30,000 applications, and in total, the undergraduate college is less than 7,000 students. So again, you're looking at fewer than 2,000 students a year being admitted. So really trying to understand where those spots go to, what goes into this whole admissions process. So when we say selective specifically rather than competitive, because I think competitive implies that it's very kind of down to a set of numbers or a few statistics that would define whether or not an applicant would get admitted. And that's not true of highly selective admissions. Rather, admission is not formulaic. It's not based on a certain test score on a standardized test plus a certain grade achievement in your high school context or a number of community service hours. While all those things might come into play in other different ways, we're going beyond that to understand something that we like to call fit. This is another term that you will hear, a great deal from folks like me talking about undergraduate admissions in the United States. When we say fit, we are trying to understand, what makes you someone who's going to be successful and happy in the context of our specific institution. Breaking that down a little bit further, we're going to look at fit on a couple different levels. Fit with academics, the way that we approach, education in the most basic terms, whether it's a liberal arts college or, an institution that maybe offers a very specifically tailored program, a very narrowly tailored program in something like engineering. And we're also going to look at the personal level. What are you bringing to our community? What are you bringing to the classroom? How does that fit with what we expect of our students would have come to make our institutions the places that they are? And then we're also occasionally, not in the instance of UChicago, but some other institutions are looking at demonstrated interest, which means an understanding of how interested you are in an institution. Because of all these factors, because we want to go beyond just a set of numbers or a formula, highly selective institutions tend to review applications what is known holistically. And so that's what I want to spend a little bit of time breaking down today, is what holistic review means, and then I'll talk a bit about what the pieces are that go into that application. So first thing to know about holistic review is it's complicated. It's not a simple process. It's not something, as we like to say, that can be done by computers. If it were, I wouldn't have a job. We really do have to delve a little bit deeper beyond just, again, what you've gotten on a test score, or what score you've gotten in a course, or what class rank you have if your school is a school that ranks. Again, when we look at holistic review, what we're trying to do is to be contextual. We are a little bit subjective inherently as a result of that, but when we say context, what we mean is that we're trying to understand exactly who you are in the context of your educational background, your personal background, the opportunities that you've had in your high school and beyond. So it's beneficial to students because we're understanding exactly where you're coming from, trying to really review you given what's been presented to you, rather than on a standard that maybe doesn't necessarily apply as well to you. If your school doesn't have class rank, for instance, it might not make sense to evaluate you in those terms. And this is one reason that we need an application that goes beyond grades and test results to include things like letters of recommendation, extracurricular activities, and essays, and I'll discuss those pieces in a moment. So one key thing to know about holistic review is that numbers alone are not decisive for any application. I always like to say that you could have a perfect test score, and that doesn't necessarily guarantee you admission. For example, you could have the strongest SAT score, you could be the top student in your school, and if you write, say, University of Chicago, an essay about wanting to go to Northwestern, we're not going to understand that you're a great fit for UChicago. Right? We want to understand that you're going to thrive in what we offer, not necessarily what another institution offers. And so, as I mentioned, essays, extracurricular involvement, letters of recommendation, hearing from those people in your educational lives, your teachers, those sort of folks are really important as we try to understand, again, not only whether you're qualified and capable of doing the academic work, but that you're going to, again, be happy and successful in the educational environment, whatever institution it is to which you're applying. So to go a little bit deeper, the way that we look at those pieces in holistic review is first and foremost in context. We're again looking at you just in your high school, not making comparisons to other institutions. And we are looking at all parts of the application. No one piece is going to weigh more. So we're not necessarily looking, say, at your test score or at your GPA or even at your essay first. It's sort of at a reader's discretion. We are reviewing the entire package of the application to get a sense of who you are as a whole. We want to understand as much about you as possible before making a decision. So the way that often works, and this differs institution to institution, the reading practices are going to change slightly from school to school, but more than one person is involved in the decision-making process everywhere. And so some institutions will read the application together, have two people at a time reading together. That's called partner-based evaluation. Other institutions are going to have a more independent model. It's sort of what UChicago does. So the way it operates at UChicago and other institutions would be having a first reader, oftentimes the person who's familiar with the high school and that territory. So for example, I mentioned that I am the primary application representative for places like Canada, Vietnam, Singapore. That also means that I am the first person actually reading the application when it comes in. So I'm reviewing the application and then it goes on to another reviewer. And then ultimately it is also discussed again in an admissions committee, which involves a larger portion of an admissions office. So why might so many people be Why might so many people be, reading this application? Why couldn't one person just review the application on their own? Well, as I mentioned earlier, assessing fit does involve some degree of subjectivity. We are human. We want to make sure that we don't make errors or that we don't have our opinions influencing a decision. And so we want to bring in multiple different perspectives, multiple different people in our admissions offices to review these applications, to think about whether or not the student is a great fit. So not just one person, but you usually will have an advocate in this process, and that's usually going to be your regional counselor, like myself. So that's a little bit about holistic review. But when we talk about how we actually review your application, what we're actually looking at, we're looking at a few different pieces in the application. So first, we have sort of 5 here listed. We have your academic preparation. We're looking at personal statements and essays, standardized testing, and I'll also discuss test optional policies, extra co-curricular activities, things outside of the classroom, and then letters of recommendation. So we're looking at sort of all of these pieces when we're making our holistic decisions, when we're doing holistic review. And again, an important thing to note, something that I think often is hard to understand, is that really no one piece among these 5 pieces, among anything else that you're submitting, are going to weigh more in our decision-making process. We do generally want to understand as much about you as we possibly can. So again, trying to understand as much as we can. The first piece here is going to be academic preparation. So with highly selective institutions, we also are generally very rigorous institutions academically. We want to know that you're going to be prepared for the level of rigor that we offer. And it's really important to us, not that we just admit a student because they want to be here, but because they're going to be prepared to be successful when they arrive. And so a key part of that at UChicago and at other institutions is evaluating, again, that level of preparation that you've received in high school. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's really important for us to be reviewing your preparation in context of your academic environment. So what that means is that we are not, again, making one-to-one comparisons with a student in one high school with a student in another high school, whether it's in the same town, the same country, or anywhere else in the world. So we are not expecting you to, say, have taken an AP course if there is not an AP course offered in your high school. We are not expecting you to, again, have had opportunities that are not available in your institution. So we are really trying to understand as much about the context that you are coming from. And so we try to look at what type of school. Are you in a public or private institution? Are you in a national curriculum that is standard? Do you have choices in that curriculum? Again, are you in a rural area where maybe there are less opportunities than someone living in a large city? Are you in a suburban area where maybe there's more, in an urban area where there are different opportunities? So really trying to understand, again, exactly where you're coming from, what's being offered to you, and also the size of the school that you're at. That's helpful in a lot of ways, again, in understanding the number of opportunities, not only in academics, but especially in academics in terms of class size, counseling, various other resources that may come with going to a larger school or with a smaller, more individualized school. So we're trying to understand all of that. We are, as I mentioned, also looking at that curriculum, really trying to understand what has been available to you. Are there honors courses, advanced placement courses, IB courses, A-levels, other national curriculums or curriculums that are specified by your school? We're looking at all of those and really trying to understand just what are you in. So again, not asking that you've taken an honors course if there are not honors courses offered at your school. Not asking that you've chosen to take a class if maybe you don't have a choice among what classes that you do take. So again, really paying attention to exactly what's been put in front of you, not trying to ask you to do things that you don't have the opportunity to do. So those are some key things to keep in mind. Another important piece in the contextual evaluation of your academic preparation is how are you doing in your school? So we're looking at your grade trends. Maybe you've shown growth. Maybe you weren't so great at math or literature or whatever it may be, but maybe you showed growth. You have those grade trends. So whether it's within a year, so from the first term to the second term, you've shown growth, or from that first year in high school to that last year in high school that we've seen a little bit of growth. We may also look at your rank in class if it's offered, but again, it's not an end-all be-all. We're not relying solely on that by any means. We may look at GPA as well as your performance in sort of those core classes, the main classes that make up the curriculum of your institution or your school. So looking again at those things that are considered the main courses in your school and understanding how you've done in them in comparison to students who are also in your school. So trying to understand that a little bit. To delve a little bit deeper into academic preparation, what we're trying to understand, as I mentioned, is what is the level of difficulty that you've had and how ready are you to be successful when you make that transition to what is going to be a really rigorous environment. You know, at UChicago and these other institutions, we do want to challenge you. It's important to us. And the types of students that we tend to attract are those students that want to be challenged. And so your transcript from high school is a really important tool for us to understand who you are, how prepared you are. And it really is the best way for us to determine how likely you are to be successful in that rigor. And so, as I mentioned earlier, when you have choices, we do really want to see that you've chosen to challenge yourself. So if there is an option between a less rigorous course and a more rigorous course, we like to see that generally you've chosen those more rigorous options. This does not mean that you need to take every single most rigorous option in your school if that's not feasible, if it's not something your counselor recommends. We always sort of defer to the leadership in our high schools to make sure that you're doing the things that are best for you. But generally want to see that you are challenging yourself. That's important to us. And when choices are available, we will look to see fit in those choices. So what that means is that, for example, at the University of Chicago, we are a liberal arts institution. So if you have that means that you're going to be taking classes in a wide array of subjects. You need to have at least some level of preparation for a wide array of subjects. And so we're trying to look and see, are you willing to take classes that maybe necessarily aren't your major interest, but that you're willing to try, you have interests outside of your major. Other institutions maybe that have a more narrowly tailored program, so something that focuses much more intently on your major, they may be looking to see that you've really taken the most challenging courses in that field. So if you're trying to go into pre-medicine or say a biological field, they may look to see what exactly has been your rigor, your options in biology or the other sciences specifically. So different institutions will look at that differently, but most highly selective institutions are just going to be looking to see that you've challenged yourself. Additionally, if you take any classes outside of high school, whether it's at a university, in a previous high school, we do want to see transcripts from all of those programs. Or if you're taking a summer course, anything that you're doing that's for academic credit that has been a part of your academic journey, we do want to see that because, again, it's giving us a better sense of how prepared you are to come to our institutions. And so that's your first piece, is the transcript. And so I like to talk about that before standardized testing for a very important reason. And that is the first bullet you see here on my page, is that standardized testing should not become an extracurricular activity. It shouldn't be something that you do over and over and over again. And one key reason for that is that I feel, and many other folks feel the same way, that your high school transcript is you for 3+ years of high school. It gives us a great sense of your time in the classroom, what you've done, the work you're capable of, particularly in the context of the resources and opportunities in front of you. Your standardized test is you for a few hours on a Saturday. So while it's important and important to many institutions, we do also rely on those other pieces. However, as I mentioned, many institutions and most highly selective institutions do require some form of primary testing. In the United States, primary testing almost always refers to the ACT or the SAT. Some key things to know about the way that highly selective institutions use these testing pieces is that, again, they do not weigh more heavily than your transcript or your letters of recommendation or your extracurricular activities. Again, just one piece. Also important is that some schools do super score their SAT or ACT. That is the case at the University of Chicago, for example, meaning that if you take the SAT multiple times or the ACT multiple times, we will combine the subsection scores to give you the strongest overall score. A small amount of schools will require the writing portion of these exams, but many no longer do so. For example, Chicago does not require writing for either of those should students submit them. There's important value to standardized testing and telling us a little bit about you, but again, not the end all be all, just a piece of the process. Some schools will also allow you to self-report your test scores. That means exactly what it sounds like. You are able to send in your test scores without paying a testing service to send them directly to us. So you simply report them in your application, and we are able to use those to review your application. That's primary testing, an important piece for some institutions, required at many highly selective schools. Many institutions will also accept or maybe even require secondary testing. So some examples of this are the AP or Advanced Placement Test scores, the International Baccalaureate or IB test or actual test or predicted scores rather, or A-level exam scores. Another really common example of this are SAT-2 subject exams. So some key distinctions with all of these that I want to make about highly selective admissions. Some institutions will require these. So some schools in particular will require SAT-2 subject exams, maybe for a specialized program. Again, some institutions, not even that are highly selective, may require a specialized SAT-2 subject for something like engineering or another field. Other schools will not require them, but will accept them. That's the case for the University of Chicago and some of our other highly selective peers, that while we don't ask that you take them, if you have taken those exams and you feel that it does represent you well, that you're really proud of the score that you've gotten on that exam, you are more than welcome to share it with us. So again, not a requirement in many institutions, some do. So as you're navigating the college search, just be aware of what their policies are, because there is a lot of variance there. You're going to have institutions that ask you for different things. Another key thing to note on secondary testing is that many schools will offer some form of credit for AP scores. At highly selective institutions, you are usually looking at a 4 or a 5 on those exams to qualify for the credit in their institutions, but other schools may accept a 3 as well. So that's another thing that may be an advantage to taking those AP exams. But again, you'll want to navigate and look really closely at admissions websites to understand what an individual school's policies are. Unfortunately, there's a lot of variability in higher education in the United States. There are, by last count, about 6,000 colleges and universities, and everybody does things a little bit differently. And so trying to understand that. Last piece that I want to mention on testing are English proficiency exams. And so many institutions are also going to require some form of English proficiency exam if you're applying from outside of the United States, from a country where a national language is not English. Other institutions like University of Chicago and many of our peers will loosen these requirements depending on what curriculum you've been in. So for example, at the University of Chicago, if you've been in an English language curriculum for 2 years, where that's the primary language of instruction, we do waive that English language proficiency requirement. Other institutions may say 3 years or 1 year, different requirements, again, institution to institution. The types of tests that you'll be looking at for this are the IELTS exam, the TOEFL exam, TOEFL, or the Duolingo exam, which is the one that's growing in popularity, something that we at UChicago recently implemented. So you're able to take a variety of different options depending on the institution. So again, another thing to be checking if you know that you will be required to do an English language proficiency exam is which ones an institution will accept. That's a piece about testing, but many institutions or some institutions also do not require testing. While this is a little less common in the highly selective realm, it is something that is growing in popularity and is becoming even more relevant kind of in the situation that we are presently in. And so University of Chicago is actually a test optional institution for all of our students. In the years past, we were test optional for domestic students or students attending high school in the United States, while we were what is known as test flexible for international students. So I'll discuss kind of what all of those mean. And so at UChicago, we are test optional. What that means is that you are not required to submit testing as a requirement for being considered for admission. It is a piece that you may submit. You are welcome to submit those SAT or ACT scores or some of those secondary testing if you would like, but you are not required. If you don't, then testing is just simply not a piece in that holistic review that I mentioned. We would instead look at your transcript to understand what your level of academic preparation is. So if you don't submit testing, your transcript really does form the basis of our academic review. It becomes even more vital in that process because it does give us the greatest sense of how prepared you are going to be. As I mentioned, some schools are choosing to do temporary test optional policies currently, given the COVID-19 situation. So it's something to also be examining, looking at admissions websites as you think about the next year, the next 2 years, kind of what that's going to look like. But many other institutions like UChicago are just generally test optional. There is also, as you might expect from the theme of my past slides, is some variability among different institutions. And so some schools, while they are test optional, may ask you for supplementary materials. So they may ask you for something like an arts portfolio or the secondary testing or a resume, things along those lines. So be aware that for particular programs or particular institutions, while they may be test optional, you might be asked for supplementary materials. Other institutions might just allow you to submit those, but not require them. So at UChicago, you're allowed to submit additional materials, but are not required. That's common among many test optional peers. Another sort of test optional policy is what is known as test flexible. And in this case, testing may be required, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the SAT or ACT. So speaking from experience, this was the University of Chicago's testing policy for the past 2 years for students who were outside of the United States. And so for students who attended high school anywhere but the United States, we could accept alternative forms of testing. This could be things like AP exams, IB scores, whether it's predicted or actual, A-level scores, or those SAT-2 subject exams. So this policy is a little less common, but also something you might want to be aware of. If you're looking at differences for students applying outside of the United States, this is probably the most common one. So if you're wondering where a school's policies might differ, and they're test optional, this might be something that you're seeing. So again, important to check in on the testing guidelines for each individual institution, particularly if they're test optional, because there's going to be some variability. But this is a great opportunity for those students who either don't have access to SAT or ACT testing sites, or who take those exams and don't feel that it represents who they are as a student. So to put that in context, we have many great students across the world who do really tremendously in their high school. And for whatever reason, whether it's unfamiliarity with the test, a lack of preparation, or test anxiety, they don't do as well on that exam. They don't feel that it represents who they are as a student. And if that sounds like you, test optional policies might be something to consider applying to those institutions that don't require testing, because you're going to be able to show who you really are as a student. So that's just another piece. Another important piece for us is understanding who you are outside of the classroom. We are trying to understand, what do you bring to our community? And so we look at your extra and co-curricular activities in something called the list, the common application, as well as the both of which are accepted at University of Chicago and many other institutions, includes a list of anything that you've done, again, outside of that classroom. You're able to tell us what it is you've done, if you've held positions, how much time you commit, as well as a little bit about your responsibilities there. It also gives us the opportunity to hear a bit about your honors or awards that you've won. Maybe you've been recognized in your local community or in your school. We want to hear about that here. Generally, students think that this should be reserved to very traditional activities, things like athletics or academic awards. But we also want to hear about things that you're doing in really any other realm. So this can include part-time work. Maybe you take care of a elderly relative or a younger sibling, those family obligations, anything you do during the summers, as well as faith-based work. So really anything that you're doing outside of the classroom, we want to hear about. We want to get a sense of what you're going to bring to our campus. As I like to say, we want to understand that when you come to our campus, you're going to be engaged in the vibrant community that we have for any of our institutions. And so it's an important piece for us. So when you think about your extracurricular activities, the way that we look at them is to go beyond the list. We're really trying to look for evidence of your engagement in terms of impact, depth, and longevity. So when we say impact, we're trying to understand whose lives have you changed on a small scale or a bigger scale in your community. It doesn't mean that we expect you all to be Nobel Peace Prize winners by the time you've graduated high school, but we want to understand that you've done something that has brought value in some way to your community, your home, your work, your family, whatever it may be. So we're looking for that evidence of impact. We're also looking for depth of engagement. We want to know, how involved are you? Did you show any leadership development? Have you, become the leader of a club or a secretary or someone who's really made that club successful? This is also an opportunity for us to see how much time you spend in these activities. And so we mentioned earlier that the Common Application does allow you to tell us how many hours a week you're spending in an activity. So that's also evidence of depth. And then longevity. We love to see things that you've done for longer periods of time. So things that you've done for multiple weeks, that maybe you've done for multiple months, or even throughout your high school career. So we're looking for those students who are sticking to some activities. Again, to get a sense that you're going to do something when you come to our campus. It can be something entirely new. We do not expect you to have the same activities throughout your time in college. We really want to see you broaden your horizons, but it's more about that evidence of engagement, that attitude towards involvement that we're trying to understand. On top of extracurricular activities, we also want to get a sense of who you are in the classroom. One helpful way for doing this is to hear from letters of recommendation. So as part of the letters of recommendation, we hear from your guidance counselors. They provide us with some important information. First, they provide us with a secondary school report or a school profile. This is how we are able to review your application in context. It gives us information about the offerings at your school, general grade trends, and helps us place where you fall academically in your institution. It's really a key part of our review. It's why we have sort of specialized readers who become familiar with our high schools and our territories. They also submit your transcripts. Most institutions are only going to allow your transcripts to come from an official source, someone from your school. So generally that's a counselor or a principal. Often if neither of those are applicable at your school, if you don't have a counselor, this can also come from another teacher as well. So we understand that some schools don't have counselors. You're not at a disadvantage there. You're still able to have that come from an official at your school. The counselor also writes us a letter of recommendation. This helps us understand your school context even further and gives us sort of a bird's eye view of who you've been in your school. What have you done outside of the classroom? What is your reputation in the community? And what kind of student are you? And again, we're looking at this in context. So if you're at a school that doesn't have a counselor, we don't expect to hear from a counselor. If you're at an institution that has one counselor for many, many students, we don't expect that letter to be quite as detailed as a school where the counselor is only working with 5 or 6 students at a time. So really, again, looking at this in context. In addition to this letter of recommendation, we hear importantly from your teachers. Most institutions will require, at least in the highly selective realm, at least one letter of recommendation from teachers. Others may require as many as 3. At UChicago, we fall right in the middle, requiring 2 letters of recommendation. Generally speaking, highly selective institutions are looking for these letters of recommendation to be written by teachers in core subject areas. There's a few listed here, but generally what we mean by core subject areas are not electives or non-academic classes. So we want to hear from those main subjects in your school, not necessarily from a coach or from something that's non-academic. This can include things that are electives if they're academics. So we want to hear from, economics teachers or literature, if it's not listed here, but really anything that is a core subject or academic in nature. And these letters are an opportunity for us to hear a story about who you are in the classroom. How engaged are you? What do you bring to the learning environment? Overall, how have you done in the course? Have you shown growth? Have you engaged with ideas? And so some advice when thinking about letters of recommendation is to choose a teacher who can really speak to all of this. Choose someone who knows who you are as a student, who can really speak to your growth over time, and choose someone who is going to write a positive letter of recommendation for you, someone who's seen you in a class that you did really well in or that you showed a lot of growth. This does not have to be in your major area of interest. Some of the best letters of recommendation I've received or read have come from teachers outside of the student's area of interest, where it demonstrated that that student was really engaged in many different subjects, was willing to learn in a lot of different settings. So really any teacher or area that you felt impactful, that class or an instructor that you think would be able to speak to who you are in the classroom, that's someone that I would recommend, seeking out for one of these letters of recommendation. Moving to the sort of last couple pieces of what we look at, we also look at essays as part of the admissions process. And so we are looking first at the personal essay or personal statement. When applying to U.S. institutions, you will have a general statement that is going to many different schools through the common application or the coalition application. And so some advice here is on a very basic level, we're trying to understand a little bit more of who you are. It's important to write clearly and concisely. So what I mean by that is don't try and write on such an expansive topic that it becomes difficult to really cover in the short amount of space that you have. So an example of that is many students try to tell us their entire life story in this personal statement. And it simply isn't enough space to do that in an effective way. So really think about maybe one topic or one moment of your life that you really can key in on. So the essay questions about this for the common application are often things like, tell us about an obstacle you've overcome or an identity that's really important to you. So focusing on one obstacle, not every obstacle, is an important way to write clearly and concisely. Choose your topic thoughtfully. I always like to tell students to follow the 3 T's, and the first one of those T's, I'll tell you the others later, is topic. Make sure that it's telling us something that doesn't come through elsewhere in the application and that is appropriate for the college application process. Make sure it's something that you would not be mortified to show to your grandmother, right? It should be an appropriate topic, but it should, as I've noted, tell us something that isn't coming through in the application. So the topic shouldn't be all of the awards you've achieved or all of the extracurricular activities that you already told us about. It should maybe be, why did you choose to get involved in that extracurricular activity? Or what did you get out of being, a member of math club or doing robotics or playing a sport? It's more about telling us not what you've done, but why you've done it. Be passionate about what you're writing. So really coming from an authentic and genuine place is important here, because if you're excited to write this essay, it's probably going to be exciting for someone like me to read, engaging for us as application readers is. And as I mentioned, it should talk about who you are. It should really be a personal essay. And so to give you some further advice, this should add dimension to what other things we're seeing. It shouldn't, again, rehash anything we're seeing in your application. We want to hear more about you, more things that we don't have an opportunity to hear about, that you can't put into that small section in the events page or the extracurricular page, or that, we aren't hearing from your teachers. We want to hear about those things that are important to you. And again, we focus on you here. It should really be about you. One of the greatest pitfalls that we see with applicants is that they, write about someone that's really important in their life, like a parent or a grandmother, and they've written us a lovely essay about that person's struggle and the things that they've accomplished in their lives. And we get to the end of that essay, and I want to admit that person's grandmother, but I don't really know too much about the applicant. So really making sure that when you look at this essay, it does tell us something about you, because that is the most important thing. Also, as I mentioned, being genuine, showing us that authenticity and showing us your voice is important. We don't expect this to be a very polished grad school essay. It's an undergraduate college essay. We want to know that it's being written by a college applicant who's in high school. We want to hear your voice. If your writing style isn't coming through, make sure you're going back and editing that yourself and understanding that it should be in your own words. We do want to hear in your own prose the way that you write and the words that you would use. Oftentimes students will go, grab a thesaurus and try and use the largest word they can find when really they would use a different word in their normal writing. Really try to stick to what your voice normally is. To give you some more general advice for personal statements, I mentioned earlier the 3 T's. The first is topic. Tone is also really important. So when you think about writing your essay, if you are having a terrible day, set that essay aside and come back to it later, because you're probably going to write an essay that has a negative tone. And generally speaking, we want to see a more positive tone. We don't want to get an essay about how angry you are at a classmate, or how mad you are that you didn't do well on an exam, or your mom did something that you didn't like. We want to hear a more positive toned essay. And then technique is the last T that I would like to mention for personal essays and personal statements. This is a very basic one. We want to hear your voice, but do make sure that you're going back and editing your essays. We want to make sure that you're not having a ton of spelling or grammatical errors throughout. If you make one mistake, it is not a big deal. You're not going to be doomed by that, but we do want to make sure that you aren't committing sort of multiple errors. An example of this that we had a few years ago was a student who wrote an essay about going pheasant hunting with his grandfather, hunting the bird pheasant, and didn't spell check, and instead wrote an essay about going peasant hunting. And so because the main idea in his essay was misspelled multiple times over and over again, it became an issue. So you want to make sure that you're checking for those simple errors. 1 second before I switch on. One last thing I want to mention on the subject of essays is that most highly selective institutions are also going to ask you to write an essay that is specific to their school. They range from as basic and straightforward as a question asking, why would you like to attend our institution? To something as strange as find X, or where is Waldo really? The latter two are examples of 2 of our prompts at UChicago. We also ask you, why us? So when you think about these essays, make sure that you aren't doing a cookie cutter essay, particularly with that why us essay. You don't want to write one essay and then send it out to a bunch of different schools. You really do want to write a specific individualized essay for each school if they are asking you for that additional or supplemental essay. So make sure that you are spending extra time to write a specific essay to each institution that's asking for it. If you're being asked to do something in a more creative vein, something that is a little more outside the box, such as those UChicago prompts that I mentioned, just make sure you're engaging with them and you're having fun. We're not looking for like a rote answer or to see that you're saying a specific thing. When a school is asking you a question that's more creative or more outside the box, they're trying to understand how it is you think, how you're approaching questions and problems. So my best advice is that if you have questions about specific essays that an institution is offering, engage with their admissions office. Ask them for specific advice about their essay topics, maybe how successful applicants have engaged with those in the past, and really understanding what they're looking for, because that'll allow you to go into that essay writing excited and knowing exactly what is expected of you. So those are the pieces that we look at. The last thing I want to note, it's not on the slide here, that may be a piece of some other highly selective institutions are interviews or stand-ins for interviews. So some institutions will require or have an optional interview. So you'll be able to do an interview virtually or in person, either with a member of the admissions staff or with an alumni. There are two types of interviews. The first is going to be informational. So that's just an opportunity to learn more about the college or university. It's a low pressure setting. You're just asking questions of the admissions office or the alumni and getting a better sense of what they offer. The other is evaluative. So they're really trying to learn a little bit more about you as a way to evaluate you in the application process. Other institutions that are highly selective will not offer interviews as a part of the process. For example, the University of Chicago does not offer interviews, but does allow students to submit an optional video profile. The last piece I want to discuss as part of this holistic, highly selective review is financial aid, an important part of making a college decision. Most highly selective institutions are going to have, fortunately, a great deal of need-based financial aid, often more so than many other less selective institutions. Generally, to apply for need-based financial aid, you'll submit a financial aid application of some sort. Some institutions will have a general application they use. Others will have one specific to their school. So at UChicago, we have an international student financial aid application, as well as an application for US citizens. Then also we will require things like tax returns or bank statements, other financial documents allowing us to understand what it is that your family might require on the need-based side of things. You will also hear schools that are either need blind or need sensitive, need aware in the review process. Need blind refers to institutions that do not take into account financial need when making decisions. Other institutions may be need sensitive, particularly for international students, those students who are not United States citizens. The school might be need sensitive. That is the case at UChicago and in most other highly selective institutions. However, at all of these institutions, UChicago and many of our peers, your application is still reviewed holistically. What that means is that we read your entire application first. We consider all of those pieces that I just mentioned. And if we would like to admit you, the last piece is financial aid. It is never the case that financial aid forces us to review an application differently from the onset. We are reviewing your application on its merits first, and then having a conversation about our ability to fund you through need-based aid. Additionally, some institutions will offer merit-based aid or merit scholarships. Many institutions will automatically consider you for these. So for example, at UChicago and other institutions, you apply, you submit an application, all those pieces that I just mentioned, and you are automatically considered for awards. You don't have to submit any other paperwork or write an essay. Others will require you to write an essay or have a certain test score. Merit-based aid or scholarships also includes talent-based scholarships. So things like musical awards or NCAA or athletic scholarships. So if you're applying on an athletic scholarship, that would be an example of merit-based aid as well. Additionally, some institutions will offer loans. In the highly selective realm, there are many institutions that do not package loans, do not require loans for their students. For example, at UChicago, we do not offer loans or packaged loans to our financial aid recipients. And then the last piece is on-campus employment. Many international students will have the opportunity to work in various positions on campus as a way of helping to fund their education. An example at UChicago, students work in coffee shops. They might serve as tour guides in our Office of College Admissions, or they might be engaged in research. So there's a lot of different opportunities for students to find paid employment, either as a part of their financial aid package or just to make some extra money towards their education. So those are some pieces, all of the pieces that I wanted to discuss in holistic review. I want to give you all a chance to ask any questions. I saw a few coming through in the chat, and I'd like to address those now. So give me 1 second to pull up this chat. So our first question is, how do we know if a university is selective? What number and stats should we look at when reviewing a school? This is a great question. So kind of an easy way to understand is the number of applications a school is receiving as well as the number of students that they're admitting. So acceptance rate is one key way to know how selective an institution is understanding how many students out of the pool that are applying are they able to admit or willing to admit. So that's a key way to know that. There are also other markers, really understanding things like rankings that institutions may have, as well as the offerings in particular programs and why those are popular. And so our next question is there a specific online portfolio I should use to apply, or just any format? So this is a great question. If we're speaking of the application itself, some schools will have their own application. So you will apply through just a single platform for them. Other schools will allow you to submit the common or coalition applications. So those are applications that you will complete one common application or one coalition application, and you can apply to a wide variety of institutions using that. So you have the opportunity to use that application platform. If you're talking about portfolios for things like art materials, maybe you want to submit some music that you've performed. Schools will also have differences here. At the University of Chicago, you're able to submit that through an account. Other times you can submit that through those common or coalition applications. So there is a specified format for each institution, including requirements and limitations as to what they might accept. Next question is, how high of a GPA does the University of Chicago require? This is a great and really common question. And the answer is, it depends. We're not looking just at your GPA, and many schools do not even calculate GPA. Others will use a wildly different scale. And so, for example, even right here in the Chicago area, we have schools that do GPA on 3-point scales, 4-point scales, 100-point scales. So we don't require a specific GPA. However, we look at how you are performing in your high school. Sometimes that's expressed through GPA, but we look beyond your GPA to also look class by class. How have you done? Have you attained a strong grade? Have you chosen to challenge yourself? So it's not just about GPA. We really caution students to move past looking at just GPA to understand that we're really looking at each of your classes to understand, maybe you have a lower GPA, but you've taken a more rigorous class option. Does your school weight your GPA, or is everything unweighted? So there's a lot of different factors, but really trying to understand that we're looking at your academic preparation in a broader sense. And I think this is our last question here is, how do we evaluate, we have a couple questions actually. How do you evaluate an applicant with SAT differently from one without SAT? So this is another really good question for those test optional institutions. And really our review process doesn't differ that much. We are just not using the test score as a part of the academic process. So or part of the review process rather. So the academic preparation piece without testing is just that transcript. So it's for those students who are very confident in their performance in high school. That would just be the one piece. If we have testing, it becomes just another piece in that review process that doesn't weigh more than the transcript. It doesn't outweigh the transcript or outweigh those other pieces. So for example, if a student has a stellar transcript, has done really, really well in their high school, and then has a slightly lower SAT, that doesn't necessarily mean that student is suddenly, marked down by any means. We take both of those in consideration together. The same thing is true if a student has a not great transcript. They have not been doing well in their high school, and then they do really well on the exam. We're still going to look at both of those. We're not going to say, oh, just because they did very well on the exam, they're a great student. And so we're looking at both of those in conjunction. We have a question about what about students at schools that have no GPA? How do you look at that? That's really when we delve in deep to class by class evaluations, as we are for all students. We're not penalizing a student for not having a GPA. It's not within their control. And actually, it's very common for schools to not report GPA or to not report rank. And so we're just looking to see, given what options are available in that school, are they taking those rigorous options, and how have they performed? What grades are they receiving in those classes? Again, looking for those grade trends that I mentioned year to year, term to term, really understanding if they've, again, chosen to challenge themselves and had the opportunity to grow. Do you know any other schools who have become test optional due to the coronavirus situation? There are quite a few. The few that I recently noticed were, I believe, Williams and Amherst have become test optional, at least for a short period of time. Again, each institution's having different responses to the current situation. I'm not sure whether those other institutions will continue those policies as Chicago is generally. But it is a possibility, and it's something to monitor because it's something that I believe many other institutions are considering. This question asked specifically about USC. Unfortunately, I don't have any further details about that. Another question is, how does test optional policy affect the University of Chicago's approach to applications? Again, not making a big difference. When we had testing as a requirement, we were still reviewing applications holistically. We were still looking at that transcript, those extracurricular activities, those letters of recommendation, and those essays, all holding equal weight. So again, it was never the end all be all, never the sole reason that we made a decision from there. We have a question about graduate school. Unfortunately, I can't address graduate school. I only handle undergraduate admissions. I'm sorry about that. Next question is about what percentage of our class usually comes from ED1 and ED2. And the answer at UChicago, at least, is that it varies significantly year to year. It's not something that tends to stay consistent for us. I don't have the numbers for this most recent year, but last year, across our 3 earlier rounds, we had fewer than half of our class come from those rounds, and just over half of our students were admitted through our regular decision round. So the majority of our students still coming through non-binding rounds, but it does vary very significantly year to year. I think that is all of the questions that I see. Let me double check here. Yes, that's all the questions I see. So thank you all for coming and being engaged this morning, tonight, this afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you are. As always, if you have questions about UChicago, about highly selective admissions in the United States more generally, please feel free to reach out to me. I meant to put my contact information on this slide. Unfortunately, I forgot to, but I will put it in the chat right now, and it is also available on our college admissions website. So if you have questions, I am more than happy to take them via email at any time.
Dominic, thank you very much for coming and doing this for us. I found it a really entertaining talk, actually. I loved the part about peasant hunting. That was really, as soon as you started the story, I was like, oh no, because I knew where it was going. Anyway, thank you. Thank everybody who listened and participated. And Dominic, if you're on the Zoom chat, Dominic has posted his email address. And keep following us on Facebook, the U.S. Consulate in Ho Chi Minh City, and you will see whatever else we have coming up. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you again.